All right, in our next segment, we're going to talk a bit about politics and science. We're hearing all of this follow the science, but it's politicians telling us this as well as we get through this COVID-19 pandemic. Joining me, Dr. Reagan Anderson, who talks quite a bit about that. Has actually written some books that dive into some of the issues surrounding the approach to how we administer and take care of healthcare. And Dr. Anderson, thanks for coming on today. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Well, I'll start right there. I know you say no, politics should not be playing a role in science, and I guess as you watch the landscape of what's happening right now, this has all got to make you cringe with that statement.
Well, it does make me cringe because science is supposed to be a pure art form. It's not supposed to have outside influences. And while medicine is an art form that we are trying to find the best way forward, it cannot be manipulated. It can't be manipulated for political gain. It can't be manipulated because somebody wants to make more money. It can't be manipulated for any of those reasons. And when somebody tries to do that, it means it's no longer science, it's conjecture. And then we're back to the Stone Ages. We're back to bloodlettings and leeches if we allow those outside influences to weigh in.
So, with that said, I mean, we even have people now because of the politics and all of this, we're not even trusting someone who's a quote-unquote scientist, for example. We don't even know who really is a scientist, I guess, who's being true to the art, as you pointed out.
Yeah, we don't. You're absolutely correct. There's so much that is happening right now for political gain. There's so much that's happening right now for economic gain. And there's so much that's happening right now for just simply personal gain. And it's hard for the average person to be able to decipher, is there secondary gain playing into this, or is this something that is actually news that you can trust? And here's the other problem with this, is that when Dr. Fauci and when other members got on TV and they gave their best recommendations at the very beginning of the COVID crisis, we were not able to do much science at that point, because it was so new. All we had was conjecture. Now, we had conjecture with a whole long history of being an infectious disease doctor and practicing medicine, and all the physicians like myself in the country knowing something about infectious disease, knowing something about how these trends tend to happen, how these diseases tend to go forward. But it was conjecture, and that's not science. And so I think a lot of people out there watching this and watching science change its mind and saying, okay, you don't need face coverings, now you should wear face coverings, and all the things that have changed over time, it's put a bad taste in people's mouths because they don't understand how the scientific process works. So the scientific process works by questioning everything and continuing to re-question everything. It is not that we think something is right, therefore it will always be right and we don't test it. It's not science. Science is continually asking what is wrong, how have we messed up, how have we missed the mark here, and then adjusting course. And for something like COVID that's brand new, all we had was conjecture. That doesn't mean that Dr. Fauci was wrong. It doesn't mean he was lying. It doesn't mean anything. All it means is that we did the best with what we had at the time, and we're still doing that. We're still having new data come in. And that should be a very settling thing for people instead of a very unsettling thing, because it means that we're continually trying to figure this out, and we're not just doing leeches and bloodletting because we think that's a good idea.
You have an interesting perspective on some of this, too, because you're a combat surgeon, basically. So you've worked where you've had to practice in times where literally things are flying at you. I'm not saying that's exactly where we're at right now, but I mean, people are calling this a war, if you will, and it's kind of an information war, if you want to call it that.
It is an information war, and you're right. I did do 2 tours in Fallujah with Marine reconnaissance, and it taught me an enormous amount in those 3 years, more than I would probably learn 20 or 30 years of being a civilian. Mm-hmm. But one of the things that it really taught me was you have to make decisions with the resources that you have available. So in other words, in Fallujah, we operated out of a building that really wasn't suitable to do anything in, except for maybe store grain or store supplies. And yet we were doing surgeries out of this room. It was the best that we had available. We didn't have CT scanners. We didn't have MRI machines. We didn't have fancy transfusion devices. All we really had were the most rudimentary, basic tools, if you could think of tools that we would have used 60, 80 years ago. And then we had to use a lot of common sense. And right now, I think what's happening with COVID, and especially what's happened in the last couple of months, is that we have had kind of the same situation of we don't have all the information. It's a brand new virus. And so what we're trying to do is use the tools that we have, number one being common sense. Taking that common sense and doing the best we can with it. And it is a war. It's an information war. And it's not just an information war on it's a new virus, so we don't know the best way to protect ourselves or the best way to treat this virus. But it's also a war on, the Republicans are saying, don't wear masks, you don't need them. And the Democrats are saying, oh my gosh, the world is ending, the sky is falling. And both are completely wrong. I mean, the world is not ending, the sky is not falling. We have a new virus that is a little bit more deadly and a little bit more contagious than the standard flu. And as time goes on, we need to find the middle ground that's scientifically based, that is common sense based. What we can't do, in my opinion, is say, well, listen, the economy is hurting, and so every school kid needs to go back to school regardless of the situation. And if you don't do that, we're going to take away some funds from some of the schools in your states, and we all know that schools don't have a surplus of funds. So when you start exerting external pressure, trying to make the science say something that it is not saying, that's problematic. Now, if you come forward and say, now look, the science says this, but the economics say this, and therefore I'm making a decision based off the economics, we might not agree with that, but at least it's not trying to turn science into something that it is not.
Would it be helpful? We can't do it now. The genie's out of the bottle. But if we weren't living in this constant bombardment of information, I think that's part of the problem, is that everything is just at us all the time. And then, quite frankly, what used to be what we thought were mainstream has become politicized as well as far as information sources. I don't think that's helpful. I think that might be part of our problem here, is there's just too much coming at us. I mean, if you could almost shut it all off for a couple of days at a time, maybe we might be able to get our head straight.
I think that's a really good point. I think it's a very important point. And I think what goes along with that is our emotional homes. And what I mean by that is all of us have an emotional home. It might be happy, it might be fearful, it might be anxious, it might be angry, fill in the blank. And if you don't know what your emotional home is, if you're old enough, think about how you responded to 9/11. Or think about how you're responding to COVID. And it will tell you, are you somebody who wants to get as much information as possible and make reasoned, well-thought-out choices? Or are you somebody who looks for articles that says the sky is falling? Or are you somebody that preferentially selects articles that say this is a hoax and it's no worse than the flu? How do you interact with this? And that's your emotional home. So if you approach this, if you approach science, this topic of COVID, this overabundance of information from your emotional home, you're going to skew the results. You're going to find the article that supports your point of view, and you're going to hold on to it. And then what you're going to do is you're going to polarize yourself against anybody else who doesn't think that way. Again, none of this is science. Science takes the best available knowledge and the best available resources, and you continually test it to see if it continues to hold true. What we are doing is we're taking this mass amount of information. We're making it fill our emotional home. So if we're anxious, we're going to be anxious about it. If we're fearful, we're going to be fearful. If we're hopeful, if we want to be helpful, we're going to be hopeful and helpful. And my point for this whole thing is that is not science. That will lead you down the wrong path, and it will allow you to politicize it. And once you politicize anything, what that does is it makes an enemy of somebody else. And so instead of us taking care of each other and taking care of ourselves, we're now just pointing fingers and yelling at each other. And so I think we need to be very careful with what we're consuming and the filter by which we consume that to make sure that we are actually getting accurate knowledge, not politicized knowledge that has an agenda to it. And it's not hard to do. I mean, if you stay away from things that are obviously anti-Trump and things that are obviously pro-Trump, if you look for scientists who are actually using data, people, after you read a couple of these things, you'll start to get the flavor of what is a scientifically written article that's just trying to get knowledge and what's out there with another agenda.
All right. Great words, Dr. Reagan Anderson. And Universal Death Care, a solution for healthcare in the age of entitlement, his book as well. Great insight. This is very interesting times we live in. I'll say that. I guess we can agree wherever we're at that I don't think we ever thought we'd be doing it this way, but here we go.
Here we go. And if I can say one last thing for you, we know that COVID preys on people with pre-existing conditions, whether that's obesity, lung disease, heart disease, that sort of thing. The one thing that everybody listening to this should be doing is thinking, am I in the 70-plus percentile of Americans who are overweight and obese right now? So if I get infected, I'm going to be at more risk? Or am I in the 30% of people who are doing what they can to eat well and diet? And if you're not in that 30%, do whatever you can to get there. Because if you get COVID or you don't get COVID, you're going to live a better life once you're there.
Sage advice. Thank you for that as well. Dr. Reagan Anderson, good to have you on today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you for your time.
You bet. All right, we're going to take a break. We'll be back with